Welcome to this video presentation on the comparison of the Gospels, focusing on the miracle stories that occur in the Bible. When we're looking at some of the building blocks of the Gospels, it's important to realize that you can learn a lot about how the Gospels are put together by looking at a few things. The parables, the miracles, the passion narrative, and the material that's unique to each of the Gospels. All of those serve as big indicators of what the authors are trying to highlight as important, and those aspects of Jesus, his life, his ministry, and who he is that they want us to focus on. So for this section on the miracles, it's important to understand a little bit about what a miracle is to these writers. A miracle, as far as a Greek concept goes, is not a transgression against nature. It's not breaking the laws of nature like a source of magic. Rather, according to the ancient world, it was thought of as an act that was committed by somebody who had access to special abilities, powers of nature that were real abilities, real powers that existed from outside of themselves, outside of the normal human experience that they could draw on, that they had access to. And the miracle stories really are all about the restoration of life in some way, such as removing fear, feeding the body, healing, returning someone from death. All of these really are about how we restore life in some way. And they illustrate or illuminate some sort of lesson that's in the gospel. Something Jesus will say, and then it'll either be exemplified in a miracle or after the miracle, as is quite common in, say, the Gospel of Matthew, for example. After a miracle, it'll be a great opportunity for Jesus to then use that as a time for teaching. So let's take a look at some of the different miracle stories. There are far too many miracles in order to talk about all of them and all of the differences, but we can highlight just a few that give you a little bit of an example and get you a start. Real quick, just looking at the story of Jesus walking on the water. It's very interesting to note that when the disciples call out to Jesus, they use very different words. One of them, in the Gospel of Matthew, they call out and they say, "Teacher, don't you care? Save us." So they call him teacher. Whereas in Mark, they say, "Save us, Lord." In the Gospel of Luke, they say, "Master." So it's a slight little variation. The story can be the same in 90% of the ways, but in one of them they call Jesus teacher, in one of them they call him Lord, and in the other one they call him master. And that really is a little but important insight into the gospel writers and what they thought was going on. Looking a little bit in depth into the cleansing of the leper is another good example, where, say, the story is in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and both Matthew and Luke have a pretty similar presentation for the most part, but then Mark will add little differences, and you want to point those kinds of things out, like in chapter 1, verse 41, when Mark says, well, all three of them have the leper going to Jesus and saying, "Lord, if you will, you can make me whole, you can make me clean." And Matthew and Luke both have Jesus heal him. Mark is the one that says Jesus was moved by pity. And it was being moved by pity that led Jesus to heal the leper. Also, notably, he tells the leper in these cases, "Don't tell anyone about this. I don't want this spread around." But Mark is quick to say, "Well, but then the leper went and told everybody about it." And then Jesus could no longer openly enter that town. In the story of the man with the withered hand, for example, we have it being very similar between Mark and Luke this time. But Matthew has it portrayed in a little bit different question. In a different way, because in the case of the withered hand, the basic story of having the other leaders of the other Jewish leaders around and watching to see what Jesus is going to do. Is he going to heal this man with the withered hand on the Sabbath? And this is going to be a big deal. Matthew is the one that takes it as an opportunity for instruction. In that case, it's a question. Are you going to heal this man? In verse 12, in chapter 12, verse 10, and Matthew says, of course I will heal this man, because it is more fitting to keep with the spirit of the law than it is to follow the letter of the law. Whereas in Mark and Luke, they are more passive observers of the situation. And in Mark even, it has Jesus being aggrieved and angry at the hardness of their hearts. They don't see it as an opportunity to learn, and in fact it leads to conflict where it has them start to plot against Jesus after he does this. Now, an example of a story that's found only in one of the Gospels, only in the Gospel of Luke, we have the story of the healing of the ear of the high priest's slave, when Jesus is going to be arrested, and one of the disciples, an unnamed disciple, who goes and strikes the high priest's slave with a sword and cuts off his ear. And Luke immediately calls him and says, "Stop! This will not be so," and heals the ear of the high priest's slave. Marking that this is not the kind of violence that Jesus will have happen in Luke's gospel. So for as much as Matthew in the previous example highlights Jesus' nature as somebody who wants to be a teacher, Luke's version is going to highlight how in his story there will not be violence against each other. This is not the world order that he wants to have, where violence will be begetting violence. And the story of healing the sick centurion's slave or son, depending on which version of the story. Now, this is a version that appears even in the Gospel of John, and there aren't really a whole lot of miracle stories that happen in the Gospel of John. But in Matthew and in Luke, in both cases, in all these cases, the centurion beseeches Jesus, and he comes and he heals the servant. It's in Luke that it's interesting that the elders of the Jews come and have to beseech to Jesus as well and say, "This man is worthy of having you come and do this because he loves our nation. He's one of our supporters." And it really gets again to that whole idea of this new world order to come, and who are our friends, who are our allies, and this is a man who has love for our nation, so therefore he is worth having his servant healed. In John's case, it's his son, not his servant, and his son is at the point of death. And Jesus says to him that unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe. It's all about belief again. And in this case, the centurion believes in Jesus, his son was healed, and he has life. And it really gets to that whole idea of belief in Jesus will lead to life. It's a life-giving thing. Finally, we have one more example. It's one of the only stories that occurs in all four of the Gospels, and that's the feeding of the 5,000. And in which case, Mark, Matthew, Luke, it's more similar because they're the synoptic Gospels. In Matthew and Luke, the disciples come and they say, we are worried, we don't have food for these people, and Jesus says, you don't need to go away. You don't need to send them away. You go give them something. And only after they say, well, we don't have enough to give them, does he say, okay, bring me the food. I will take care of it. In Mark, it's a different tone. It's more questioning, and he says, all right, well, how much food do you have? Let's see what we can make out of this. Let's see what we can do. And they bring him the food, and he takes the loaves and the fishes, and he feeds all 5,000 people with them. And then in John's version, significantly, it's the one faithful lad, the young boy who is the one that believes in Jesus. Again, he believes in Jesus, and everyone is fed. He willingly takes what he has, and he has faith that it will work, that Jesus can feed everyone and, again, be a life-giving thing, and he does do that. So once again, these miracle stories, even when they're similar and even in their differences, we can see how they exemplify these different ideas of who Jesus is to these people. So thank you very much for watching the presentation, and I hope that you enjoyed it.